Welcome to a special edition of Colorado Outdoors Magazine, the 2024 Fishing Guide, read by John Arnold. Fish for the Finicky by Eric Wetterston. In the quote-unquote olden days, if we caught a fish big enough to keep, it was, well, a keeper. Those fish were introduced to beer batter, christened with tartar sauce, and served as a Friday night special in the household of my youth with no objections from anyone except the fish. Somewhere along the way, I realized that in order to catch a 4-pound bass, I needed to not be eating all the 2-pound bass. Not to mention that cleaning fish made me late for work. And if I showed up late for work smelling like fish, it made the ruse a lot harder to sell. That bias was compounded after spending most of my high school evenings and weekends within 6 feet of a deep fryer, thus cementing my aversion to fried food. Then, somewhere along the way, I acquired a taste for fine seafood, those light white fillets, having never crossed paths with a batter or fryer. They showcased a delicate fish flavor, accented with light but fresh produce that I didn't know existed as a youth. Discovering a late affinity for saltwater somewhere in the south of the 30th parallel, I spoiled myself with grouper, snapper, and even sushi that fell victim to my spear earlier the same day. Coming full circle in my later years, I realized it wasn't the fish that was the problem, just my inspiration. Why not take those fine fish, those crappie and walleye in particular, and level up the end game? I realized that with a bit of finesse, a humble Colorado creel can stand tall against its saltwater brethren and please the most finicky of diners. Damn the fryer, sharpen the knives and pull that bag of crappies out of the freezer, for our reservoirs have a gift that deserves a taller pedestal. Yes, sometimes you need to feed the neighborhood, and no argument here, a fish fry is just the ticket. However, sometimes you need to put down a fine meal to impress your spouse, your in-laws, and with any luck, justify the cost of your new boat. These are for that second scenario. With a few words with dealing with top-shelf fish. Concept. Fine fish are delicate. The recipes herein are targeted at those top-shelf freshwater fish that need a little more care to prepare. Not to worry, I've got the plans for bass and catfish that I'll share another time, but for now, we're dealing with the Fabergé eggs of fish. The objective is to introduce some crispiness without overpowering the subtlety, and the challenge is to achieve that without them falling apart. We can do it with breading, and better yet, we can do it by introducing nuts or toppings that create that same effect. Prepping. Food doesn't like to brown until the surface has no more water to evaporate. So, if something starts oversaturated, the flavor is less concentrated, and it'll be cooked before it starts to brown. That's the part of the reason we dry age beef. As such, prep fish fillets by rinsing, patting dry, then allowing to air dry before cooking. That'll help you get a crispier finish without overcooking. Cooking. If you're going to pan fry a fish, crispiness means pan conductivity. But like most things in life, it's a trade-off. Fish tend to be as sticky on a frying pan as they are slippery in the hand. However, I generally recommend against a nonstick pan if you can get away with it. Teflon and related nonstick pans just don't transfer heat as effectively as copper, cast iron, or stainless steel, and as such, those nonstick pans won't brown the fish as effectively. That said, nonsticks has its virtue if the situation warrants it. Bottom line, I like a well-seasoned cast iron pan for fish that are uncoated or have bread-based coating. However, fish that are dredged in flour or in a marinade that has any sugars in it benefit from nonstick, as does the cook and those within earshot. For the following recipes, I'll read the name and a short description with a little bit of the ingredients, but to get the full list and full preparation and execution of the dish, visit ColoradoOutdoorsMag.com. Recipe 1. Crappie topped with basil, pecan, and tomatoes. The tangy ingredients combined with the nutty, crunchy pecans give the impression of a deep-fried crispiness balanced with garden freshness. Basic ingredients include walleye, crappie, tilapia, or similar fish, filleted with skin removed. 4 fillets are about right for this recipe. You can do more if you have a large pan or cook it in phases. Recipe 2. Fish in zesty shallot and caper sauce. This recipe uses crisp fried shallots to give the dish more texture, then adds a powerfully tangy finish. Ingredients: walleye, crappie, tilapia, or similar fish, filleted with skin removed. 4 fillets again are about right for this recipe. Recipe 3. Crunchy crappie with mango salsa. This gives you crunch without deep frying and a Caribbean-inspired salsa for a fresh but robust flavor that will please the most finicky of diners. Again, ingredients include walleye, crappie, tilapia, or similar fish filleted with skin removed. Eric Wetterson is the Regional Director of Colorado Ducks Unlimited. This article is copyrighted by the author. You may leave comments for the author by emailing ewfeedback@google.com. Colorado's crayfish. Native crayfish play a vital role in their ecosystems. Article by Lisa Ballard. "Look what I found!" shouted my 12-year-old stepson Micah, holding up a crayfish as the clear lake water gently ebbed and flowed against his knees. "Can we eat it?" Micah was delighted by his live treasure, though the 3-inch-long crayfish was less enthusiastic. It wiggled and arched its back, splaying its pincers, but they were unable to reach the boy's thumb and forefinger, which held the little lobster-like creature on either side of its thorax body. In fact, lobsters are a larger saltwater cousin of Colorado's smaller freshwater crayfish, also called crawdads, crawfish, mudbugs, and yabbies. What's a crayfish? The term crayfish likely comes from a similar-sounding French word for them, écrevisse. However, a crayfish isn't a fish. Though it has gills, it's an aquatic crustacean like freshwater shrimp. It doesn't have internal bones. Instead, a crayfish has an exoskeleton that it must shed periodically to allow it to grow. The scientific name for crayfish, Decapoda, is Latin for 10-footed and more accurate. A crayfish has 10 legs, though the front 2 are its sizable claws, which it uses mainly for defense and capturing food. Of its remaining 8 legs, 4 are used for walking forward and 4 are used for swimming backward, which is the primary direction the crayfish swims. It also has small appendages on its tail, called swimmerets, that help repel it in the water. When danger lurks, a crayfish relies on a lightning-fast tail flip, during which it whips its tail under its body to instantly roll backwards, hopefully out of harm's way. The swimmerets also serve an important reproductive role, helping to hold hundreds of eggs under a female's tail. A female crayfish doesn't just lay her eggs and leave them. Instead, they ride along under her tail, which protects them from predators. After a month, they hatch into what look like very tiny crayfish. These fry stay glued to their mother through 3 molts, after which they are ready to swim on their own. A crayfish has yet another obvious protuberance, a pointed rostrum that jets forward like a hard, flat nose, but it's not used to detect odors. The nostrum's main function is to shield crayfish's compound eyes, which can move independently of each other. Besides its eyes, the creature's antennae are its other key sensory organs, used for tasting food, touching, and to maintain its balance. Micah's crayfish made clicking noises as he held it above the water. All crayfish vocalize this way, but not with vocal cords. Instead, a small appendage that sucks water and air through its gills makes sound that are often likened to Morse code. Scientists theorize that these sounds alert other crayfish to potential predators, like 12-year-old boys named Micah. Another interesting fact about crayfish and other crustaceans is the color of their blood. which is blue, not red. Crayfish blood is rich in the copper-based substance hemocyanin, which turns blue when oxygenated. By comparison, the blood of humans and other mammals contains iron-based hemoglobin, which turns red when oxygenated. Where do crayfish live? Crayfish can be found in the shallow areas of lakes and ponds where there's rocks and bottom vegetation, though they can also live in slow-moving rivers and creeks with a similar substrate. They're more active during the summer when the water is warmer and their metabolism increases, and easier to spot at night because they are generally nocturnal. Micah found his crayfish during the course of turning over stones as he waited by the lake shore near the campground where we were spending a couple nights. His catch was likely hiding among the cobbles waiting for nightfall, after which it would have emerged to scavenge for bugs, small fish, algae, plant matter, and other natural detritus on the bottom of the lake. Likewise, crayfish are a food source for fish like bass, panfish, and pike, wading birds like heron, and terrestrial animals like raccoons, otters, and humans. Later that day, we boiled the tail of Michael's crayfish, along with 4 others we caught. They tasted vaguely fishy and bland, and really needed some lemon, cocktail sauce, or other spices to perk them up, but we didn't have anything like that with us. Quote, "One day, we'll have to have a real crawdad boil like they do in Louisiana, but we'll need a lot more than 4 crayfish," end quote, I mused. The classic crayfish used for traditional boils in the southeastern part of the United States are red swamp crayfish, which are not native to Colorado. However, starting this year, 2024, live red swamp crayfish can be legally imported, transported, and possessed in Colorado for human consumption. But live, non-native crayfish can also wreak havoc on the state's waterways. Red swamp crayfish remain illegal as bait for fishing, and you must have a permit and receipt showing where and when you acquired them to import, transport, or possess them. On second thought, it might be easier to simply order them in a restaurant or figure out how to make native ones taste better. Colorado's crayfish. There are over 600 known species of crayfish in the world. 8 of them can be found in Colorado, generally on the eastern side of the Continental Divide. Any crayfish on the west side of the divide were likely placed there by anglers who used them as live bait or illegally stocked them to enhance the food base for game fish. Micah's crayfish and the 3 others we caught were all virile crayfish, also called northern crayfish, which are native. Virals like rocky substrates, unlike their cousins paper shell crayfish, another Colorado native, which prefer mud and weeds. Like other crayfish, both virals and paper shells can survive in a wide water temperature range from 32 degrees to 89 degrees, though they are most active when the water temperature is in the 70s. There are 5 other native crawfish species in Colorado waterways: Causey's ringed, water nymph, devil, and northern clearwater crayfish. And then there's the rusty crayfish, a non-native invasive species. Renegade rusties. Originally from the Ohio River Basin, rusty crayfish started appearing outside their native range in the 1960s after anglers dumped them in other water systems. About 5 inches in length at maturity, they have brown bodies with dark black bands on the tip of their gray-green or red-brown claws. The main way to tell a rusty crayfish from other crayfish is by the rust-colored patch on either side of its body at the spots where you would hold it if you were to pick it up. Rusty crayfish have a big appetite for small fish, insect larvae, fish eggs, aquatic vegetation, and just about anything else they can get their claws on. They ruin underwater habitats and are so aggressive that native crayfish cannot compete. Once in residence, the rusties eat so much that they alter and reduce the food web and sheltering plant life. This forces other hungry crayfish and fry fish to forage more often in the open, which makes them more vulnerable to predation. Rusty crayfish spread easily too. These unwelcome invasives can hybridize with native crayfish, depleting native gene pools. After crayfish mate, the female holds the sperm until she is ready to produce eggs. One rusty female can populate a new body of water if she has mated and either has sperm in her sperm sac or fertilized eggs under her tail. There's more. Fish that would normally eat crayfish shy away from the rusty variety because they are such aggressive fighters. Rusty crayfish can also carry zebra mussel larvae, another invasive species, which attach to their hard exoskeleton. Bottom line, rusty crayfish cause underwater mayhem. In 2009, rusty crayfish were confirmed west of the Continental Divide in Catamount Reservoir, the Yampa River, and Stagecoach Reservoir near Steamboat Springs, and in Sanchez Reservoir near San Luis. They appeared to be contained in those water bodies until last summer when, unfortunately, rusty crayfish were found in Lake Granby, a headwater for the Colorado River, which gives these feisty crustaceans access to a couple thousand miles of water. Unfortunately, there is no known way to control rusty crayfish besides harvesting them, which won't completely eradicate them from a lake or river. At best, it minimizes their impact. There are chemicals that biologists could use, but it would kill off all crayfish, not just the undesirables, which is why preventing their spread into new water bodies is so important. Perhaps Mike is onto something eating them. Apparently, rusty crayfish are among the tastiest of the crayfish species, though Colorado has strict regulations about harvesting and transporting fish. I was relieved that Micah's crayfish and the others we caught were not rusty crayfish. It was fun to find them and to taste them while camping. Native crayfish play a vital role in the ecosystem where they live. Next time, I'll have a few culinary ingredients along in case we catch a few more. Did you know? Female crayfish look for a mate and fight at the same time. It's her way of deciding who the strongest male is, and thus the more desirable male. How can you prevent the spread of rusty crayfish? If you fish with live bait, use only bait species native to Colorado. Never bring live bait, including crayfish, into Colorado from another state. Do not throw unused live bait or unwanted aquatic pets or plants into a reservoir, lake, stream, river, or pond, or any other body of water. Thoroughly clean, drain, and dry your boat and fishing gear before launching it in any body of water in Colorado. If you harvest crayfish, remove the tails immediately and pack them in ice to transport them. If you find crayfish west of the Continental Divide, kill them by separating the head from the tail. Do not transport live crayfish west of the Continental Divide in Colorado. It is illegal. Before you cook them. As of January 1st, 2024, it is now legal to import, transport, and possess live red swamp crayfish in Colorado for human consumption within these parameters. They can only be kept alive for 72 hours while in your possession. If you possess live red swamp crayfish, you must have an importation license and a receipt showing the date you acquired the crayfish. If you purchase crayfish from a commercial vendor, store, the seller needs to give you a copy of their importation license and a receipt showing the date they acquired the crayfish. Note, if you order cooked crayfish at a restaurant, these restrictions do not apply. A regular contributor to Colorado Outdoors, Lisa Ballard is an award-winning freelance writer and photographer. While Maine lobster is her favorite dish, her taste for crayfish is still to be determined. She hangs her waders in Red Lodge, Montana, but has fished throughout the Rockies for most of her adult life. See more at Lisa, BALLARD outdoors.com. Secrets of Colorado's Top Guides. On the Stream with Rachel Lineweber. Article by Dennis McKinney. Rachel Lineweber grew up in a world centered around fly fishing. She was 6 years old when her parents bought the Angler's Covey Fly Shop in Colorado Springs. Growing up in a fly shop, she acquired the knowledge, the experience, and the passion for fly fishing that would propel her to the top of the sport. Today, she's a top guide, dedicated instructor, and general manager of the fly shop. She graciously accepted an invitation to share some of her secrets. One morning in late October, Lineweber and Andrew Cosico, a friend she was teaching to fly fish, met with Colorado Outdoors for a day of instruction and fishing on the stretch of the South Platte River known as the Dream Stream. Located between Spiny Mountain and 11 Mile Reservoir, the Tailwater Fishery is famous for year-round quality trout fishing and for a fall run of kokanee salmon from 11 Mile. After rigging up 4 fly rods in the parking area, 2 for trout and 2 for kokanee, Lineweber and Cosico walked to the river and began fishing in the big pool below the bridge. The first order of the day was centered on fly presentation. Quote, "What's fun about this place is that you have a double current," Lineweber pointed out. "You have the one main current that is flowing downstream and the other that flows back around the pool. So we're going to begin by casting up into the main current and let the fly swing around with the back current, where the fish will be facing downstream," end quote. With no room for a back cast, Lineweber instructed Cosico to make a roll cast upstream to the head of the main current and immediately make a downstream mend in the fly to get the flies down and let drift naturally near the bottom. They focused on the small white strike indicator as it floated on the surface. When the fly swung around to the backwater, she instructed Cosico to mend the line again for a drag-free drift. Quote, "One little thing I do," Lineweber said, "that I haven't seen any other guy do because they would think it's super corny, is that I draw smiley faces on my indicators. The reason is that with just one solid color, you cannot see the subtle little twitches. The trout here are so picky that they can take a fly in and spit it back out, and the strike indicator will just make a subtle twitch. And smiley faces make it a lot easier to see that switch," end quote. She instructed Cosico on the finer points of controlling the drift. Quote, "Adjust the slack in the fly line and always keep the line under your trigger finger. Maintain tension on it all the time. Keep the rod high. Do not drop the tip toward the fish. Maintain that tension until you're absolutely sure there's nothing live on the other end. When setting the hook," she said, "always swing the rod downstream to pull the hook back into the fish's mouth. When you are in the far current, which is moving right to left here, you're going to set left. When the fly enters the back current, which is flowing left to right, you will set right," end quote. Lineweber also applies her attention to detail with the precise rigging of flies, tippet sizes, and knots. She opened a small fly box and said, quote, "Talk about secrets. Here's my pegged worm box. I cut chenille into little 2-inch sections, some in colors, some just brown, then my bare hooks and some pegged eggs," end quote. Lineweber uses pegged worms and eggs because they are much safer for the fish than worms and eggs tied on hooks. Quote, "Many times," she said, "a fish will inhale and swallow a regular chenille fly too deeply. A pegged egg is a bead tied on the tippet, above a bare hook. When a fish eats the bead, it immediately realizes that it's fake and spits it out. Then the bare hook catches the fish safely in the jaw every time," end quote. Pegged worm. Quote, "For pegged worms, I pre-cut 2-inch strips of chenille in different colors. Then I touch a lighter to each end to give it more of a worm-like taper. I keep these prepared worms in a box along with bare hooks, generally the size number 14 or number 16 Temco 2488H scud hook. To rig, I tie on a bare hook to my tippet and then tie a loose standard overhang knot 2 inches above the hook. Next, I put on the end of a chenille strip about a 1/4 inch from one end into the center of the overhand knot. Then tighten it down, making sure the distance between the worm and the hook is 2 inches. The reason I don't tie the knot in the middle of the chenille is because the worm then bends in half, which doesn't look realistic at all." Prepped eggs. For prepped eggs, I use a similar method. In my same pegged worm box, I keep round beads in different colors and use the same bare hooks. To attach them, I don't use the actual pegs that are made for them, or use the popular toothpick method. I have found that method tends to slip down more often, which gets really annoying. Instead, before attaching the bare hook to the tippet, I simply thread the tippet through the egg, then all the way around and back through the same way twice. I keep the tippet really loose during this step so that I have lots of room to tie on the bare hook before snugging down the egg. I make sure the distance from the egg to the bare hook is 2 inches. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I find that if that distance is too long, it can increase the likelihood that fish gets foul. And if the distance is too close, then you'll miss the set entirely." End quote. For the tippet in this situation, she uses Trout Hunter brand. Quote, "Trout Hunter is my favorite tippet by far, and I use a size 5.5 for this game. I often wonder if it really matters, but I feel that 6X is a little too weak and 5X is too heavy." End quote. Instead of a clinch knot, Lineweber uses a double Davy knot. She said that holds better and doesn't have a large amount of tippet hanging out, which is important for tiny midges. Quote, "It's hard to be into fly fishing and not be into bugs," she said. "I carry specific boxes for midges, caddis, mayflies, but I'm never without my everywhere box." The box has a leaf in the middle, so there are 4 sides. The top left side has a variety of dry flies in several sizes and row of terrestrials. Below the rows are tiny midges. One half of the first leaf is for RS2s in 4 different colors. A whole line each for gray, black, olive, and purple. Below the RS2s are rows of the classic Baetis nymph, pheasant tails, and hare's ears. The next page is caddis, worms, and eggs. The back page is stoneflies with stillwater flies below." End quote. Lineweber pointed out a few kokanees flashing in calm water on the far side of the river and a few more downstream at the tail out of the long pool. Quote, "Andrew," she said, "grab the coke roll. It has a pegged red worm and a pegged egg." End quote. For kokanee, she recommends heavier equipment and leaders because the salmon are not tippet shy. Quote, "You can use a 5 weight, she said, "but I prefer a 6 weight because kokanees are super strong. We call it roping up, so I will go for a 2X for both of my leader and my tippet, and on that I will use a pegged worm and a pegged egg. I prefer flies in red because kokanee often take a fly out of aggression rather than hunger. Red kind of gets their attention and makes them mad. I usually use 2 flies with a size 12 or 14 red worm and a red egg or a copper john." End quote. While Cosico cast for the kokanee, Lineweber picked up a trout rod and pointed it towards several trout swimming just below the surface in the main current. While she removed the strike indicator, she explained, quote, "When trout are suspended like that, they're probably taking emergers and will be indicator shy." End quote. To imitate an emerger, she decided to try a mole midge fly. Quote, "The mole midge," she said, "is a midge fly that is designed so that the back sinks and the top floats." End quote. Master fly tyer Charlie Cravens of Arvada created the mole fly to imitate a crippled midge or a mayfly emerger that is trapped in the surface film. Lineweber said she thought he called it a mole fly because the feather hangs over the eye of the hook. On the next cast, a large rainbow trout took the mole fly. When she set the hook, she said, quote, "Okay, it's on the 5.5X tippet and a size 24 fly, so this could be interesting," end quote. Moments later, her line went slack and the fly broke off. Quote, "Shoot, he took my fly and my tiny tippet. That will get your heart pumping. But I had a feeling that the tippet was just too tiny. That was a very large trout," end quote. Fishing upstream from Lineweber, Cosico had switched to a trout rod, rigged with a pair of nymphs, and was drifting them near the bottom beneath the strike indicator. The small white indicator with a smiley face dipped beneath the surface, and Cosico swept the rod downstream, setting the hook into a fish. He played the fish into calmer water, where he led the colorful cutbow trout into his net. Lineweber came over and gently held the trout in the net as she easily removed the barbless hook from its jaw. After a few quick photos, Lineweber slipped the trout back into the water. Quote, "Way to go, Andrew," end quote, Lineweber said with a high five. Dennis McKinney is a freelance writer and photographer. He was a videographer for Colorado Parks and Wildlife until his retirement. This article is copyrighted. Fishing for ghosts. Chasing Arctic Grayling in the Heart of Colorado's Wild. Article by Dustin Dos Cosil. In the shadowy corners of Colorado's angler lore, whispered rumors circulate about a creature with a flamboyant dorsal fin, a piscatorial outlaw known as the Arctic Grayling. Akin to a betta fish on steroids, this elusive species flaunts its vibrant, sail-like fin in the crystal-clear waters it calls home. Tales of its presence, particularly in the enigmatic Pearl Lake near Steamboat, had been brewing in my mind for years, a narrative lurking in the back alleys of my thoughts until it clawed its way to the top of my priority list in the fall of 2023. With a scent of adventure in the air, I reached out to the Colorado Kayak Fishing Club, seeking kindred spirits for this piscine pursuit. Justin Collins, a father, social worker, and emerging master of the kayak angling domain, answered the call with infectious enthusiasm, and the stage was set for our rendezvous with the grayling. Arctic graylings, kin to the salmonid royalty, span continents from North America to distant reaches of North Korea. In the frigid waters of mainland Alaska, they grow to formidable sizes, but here in Colorado, they are relatively pint-sized rebels, with the state record barely scratching the surface of their potential. Pearl Lake, nestled 28 miles north of Steamboat Springs, reveals itself as a hidden gem, a 167-acre jewel adorned with cutthroat, rainbows, brook, and brown trout, and, of course, the elusive grayling. The 75-foot deep body of gold medal water beckons the kayak angler's paddle, promising a fix of tranquility in the midst of nature's splendor. Justin Collins, a relative greenhorn in the realm of kayak fishing, proved to be no novice. With 2 master angler catches and the 2023 Colorado Kayak Fishing Club Anglers of the Year title under his belt, he was the ideal companion for this escapade. As the autumn sun painted the landscape in hues of gold, our journey unfolded. The drive from Silverthorne to Pearl Lake transformed into a canvas of yellows and reds, a spectacle that demanded frequent stops for impromptu snapshots. The pit stop in Steamboat for a slice of Cajun pizza from Bojo's and a fly supply run at Steamboat Fly Fisher added the necessary seasoning to our adventure. Our campsite, perched on a hill overlooking the lake, offered a postcard view of rolling hills draped in the golden tapestry of fall. After brief introductions, we launched into the still waters in search of grayling. The evening unfurled with a few stalker trout in our nets, but it wasn't until Justin felt the ferocious tug on his Tasmanian devil lure that the true spectacle unfolded. A grayling, nearly 15.5 inches of piscatorial prowess, half an inch beyond the coveted Colorado Master Angler threshold. Yet, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows lengthened, the grayling proved to be capricious, eluding our grasp throughout the night. Undeterred, we regrouped at camp, stargazing for the next day's pursuit. Dawn broke with a calm that belied the cold's sharp bite. Back on the water, we traversed the lake's expanse, from the south end to the dam, around to the boat ramp, casting our lines in pursuit of Arctic grayling. Despite Justin's triumphant catch the day prior, the elusive creature remained, well, elusive, ignoring cast after cast, fly after fly. By noon, as the wind stirred the lake's surface into frothy rebellion, we conceded defeat for the moment, retreating from the water's edge. Although the grayling proved elusive in quantity, the sight of one up close and personal marked our journey as a victory. A wild tale spun in the embrace of Colorado's untamed waters, where legends swim beneath the surface, waiting to be unraveled. Dustin Dos Cosil is a freelance writer and photographer. This is his second time writing for Colorado Outdoors. This article is copyrighted by the author. The long and the short of it: nymph fishing for trout. Anglers fishing with nymphs in rivers and streams need excellent line control and must constantly adjust leader length and weight. Article by Ron Balak. I watched the red and white plastic sphere bob up and down in the waves, anxiously anticipating its pull beneath the surface. Fast forward decades, and I'm again excitedly watching the plastic sphere and waiting for a worm to entice a trout. However, some things have changed. I now have facial hair, a deeper voice, a smaller bobber, and a fly rod. I also created my worm from orange Chanel, rather than rummaging through the garden at night with a flashlight. Many of us enjoy fishing with floating indicators because they take us back to our childhood. The bobber going under is great fun, whether you're 6 or 60. Today, however, we use floating indicators to detect strikes because most trout in moving water feed predominantly near the bottom, and we can't see their takes. Their food is invertebrates, mostly scuds, worms, crayfish, and the immature stages of aquatic insects known as nymphs. We refer to the pursuit of trout mostly near the bottom of streams and rivers with imitations of these invertebrates as nymph fishing. Unlike dry fly fishing, nymph fishing is possible year-round because aquatic organisms spend the vast majority of their lives at or near the bottom. Several methods of nymph fishing exist, and nymph fishing is not restricted to moving water. In addition to using a traditional fly rod and floating indicator, you can also nymph fish with tenkara rods, or in the European styles of the Czechs, Poles, French, and Spanish, who do not use floating indicators or added weight. We will restrict this article to nymph fishing with traditional fly rods on larger streams and rivers, but will also incorporate some of the tricks used by Europeans. For an in-depth discussion of nymph fishing on small mountain streams, on still waters, with tenkara rods, and in the European styles, please see my book, Fly Fishing Colorado's Backcountry, 2018. I supplemented this article with materials from 3 excellent books published by Stackpole Books: Jason Randall's Nymph Masters, Fly Fishing Secrets from Expert Anglers, 2017, George Daniels' Dynamic Nymphing, Tactics, Techniques, and Flies from Around the World, 2012, and Pat Dorsey's Fly Fishing Tailwaters, Tactics and Patterns for Year-Round Waters, 2015. Indicators are either floaters made of plastic, cork, foam, or yarn that suspend flies and aid in their drift, or slightly made of brightly colored pieces of monofilament built into the leader for the sole purpose of detecting strikes. Some anglers can, remarkably, detect strikes without an indicator and instead look for movement at the point of the entry of their leader in the water, at a knot in the leader, or the tip of their rod. I am not one of these anglers and need an indicator. Floating indicators are the most popular indicators because they are easy to see, adjustable, require little maintenance, and are deadly under the right conditions. They're most effective when fishing in slow to moderate moving water, casting far, executing long drifts, and nymphing from a drift boat. Floating indicators all have design limitations, although some advantages far outweigh these limitations. Brightly colored indicators can scare trout at times, especially in slow-moving, shallow, or unbroken water. Sometimes, however, trout will try to eat your indicator, and you will wish it had a hook. Spooky trout can be pursued using a clear or white indicator, which looks more like a non-threatening bubble or foam, or with a more visible black indicator, which looks like flotsam. Strike indicators can create a hinge in the leader, which interferes with presentation and detecting strikes. The most commonly used strike indicator, the thingamabobber, accentuates this hinge and kinks one's leader. Adhesive pinch-on foam indicators are not adjustable and cannot support heavy flies. Yarn indicators made from polypropylene are the most sensitive for strike detection, but they can be difficult to cast in windy conditions and need periodic treatment with a floatant. Floating indicators can face bigger limitations due to varying speeds of currents in streams and rivers. Due to friction, currents slow along the bank and the bottom. They are fastest toward the middle of the river and at or just below the surface. Below the surface, a current speed decreases with depth, being slowest at the bottom. This is where trout hang out, expending the least amount of energy to fight the current and waiting for the bottom-dwelling invertebrates to float by. When we use floating indicators, however, it's moving faster than the flies on the bottom, and it can unnaturally drag the flies instead of tumbling them along or pulling them upward off the bottom. We may miss subtle takes because we don't have a taut linear connection between our indicator and flies due to a bow in the leader caused by varying speeds of the current with depth. Our flies also drift behind the indicator rather than under it. The faster the water, the farther behind the flies will drift. Fortunately, anglers can compensate for the limitations of floating indicators, and the first step is to use the correct tackle. Most Colorado anglers prefer a 9-foot, 5-weight fly rod, and this is a good nymphing rod, but a 9.5 or 10-foot rod will give an angler better reach. Of course, one will use a floating line matched to the weight of the rod, but anglers should be especially diligent on cleaning this line and adding floating to the tip so that it doesn't sink and put added drag on the indicator. Anglers have many opinions on the correct type and construction of leaders when using floating indicators. Randall, Daniel, and Dorsey all suggested starting with a 9 or 7.5 foot knotless, 3X or 4X tapered leader and adding length of 5X or 6X fluorocarbon tippet with a blood knot, surgeon's knot, or tippet ring. They differ in the arrangement of the terminal tackle attached to the tapered lead. I prefer starting with a 9-foot 4X tapered lead and cutting off some of the butt because I find it too stiff and difficult to uncoil. I then use a surgeon's knot to attach 12 to 14 inches of 5X fluorocarbon tippet, to which I'll then tie on a heavy nymph. I then attach another section of fluorocarbon leader to the eye or hook bend of this nymph with a clinch knot and tie on a lighter nymph. I add split shot just above the surgeon's knot and finally add the thingamabobber or yarn indicator above the split shot at a distance equal to 1 1/2 times the depth of the water. My total leader is long enough to reach deeper depths, but short enough to cast without becoming a tangled mess. This is often about 10 feet in total length. Presentation is more important than fly patterns, except during a hatch. Imitating the larval and pupal stages of local midges and caddis, mayfly nymphs, scuds, and worms is always a good strategy. However, anglers must constantly adjust the weight of their split shots so the flies stay on the bottom and tumble along naturally. When presenting nymphs properly, the indicator should float downstream slower than the surface current to match the slower current on the bottom. Too much weight results in a noticeable drag on the indicator sinking and/or frequent snags on the bottom. If not occasionally tagging the bottom, however, you need more weight. I think anglers err more often by not using enough weight. Occasionally I'll step into a run that an angler has just vacated after unsuccessfully fishing it. I add more weight than I think is necessary and often catch a fish or two. You may also need to adjust the length of the leader between the indicator and weight. Too long a leader can result in snagging the bottom or dragging flies along unnaturally. Too short a leader will lift the flies off the bottom. Other adjustments are also needed to attain a good presentation. One way to get flies down to the bottom quicker and thereby get a longer effective drift is to modify someone's upstream cast. This is done with a tuck cast, whereby one stops the forward cast abruptly and slightly lifts up the rod tip, causing the flies and weight to land in the water first and downstream of the indicator. If everything lands in a zone where the surface current is of one speed, a proper presentation is more likely. However, this seldom happens with long casts since drag results due to surface currents of varying speed. Drag is lessened by throwing an upstream mend in the line. If the drift is long, several mends may be needed. One can also mend in the air while casting with a reach cast. One abruptly stops at the end of the forward cast, then reaches one's arm 90 degrees upstream. One keeps a little extra line in one's hand so that the rig is not pulled back at oneself. In addition to mending, one should point the rod tip at the floating indicator and follow it downstream, keeping the rod tip at a constant height above the indicator. In a perfect short drift, both the line and the leader are held off the water. The only point of contact with the water's surface is the indicator. Fishing short drifts with line and leader off the water is referred to as high sticking. Although in true high sticking, one holds the rod higher and uses a slighter rather than a floating indicator to minimize drag. One actively leads the flies and weight downstream. This method takes much more skill than using a floating indicator and is more demanding, as one must extend one's arm out over the water and constantly watch the slider while ensuring that the flies are drifting properly on the bottom. When lifting up a rig at the end of a drift, the flies would be upstream from the slider to ensure a good drift. However, if the flies are downstream from the slider, one needs to add more weight or slow the speed at which one is leading the flies. High sticking, which is a modification of the Czech and my ancestors' Polish styles of Euro nymphing, works best with short drifts close to trout holding in broken water, and when the depth of the river doesn't vary markedly. If one does much high sticking, it pays to invest in a longer, lightweight rod with a softer tip to fish with longer leaders. When achieving the near-perfect drift with nymphs, it is important to recognize strikes. Pat Dorsey told me years ago, quote, "If your indicator moves, set the hook. If your indicator stops, set the hook. If you think about a fish, set the hook," end quote. While this latter sentence may be an exaggeration, I think he meant that you do not always see the strike, but instead may sense or feel it. Jason Randall has donned scuba gear and watched trout take flies beneath a floating indicator and observed that many times it does not move. He even showed me a video of this. Trout don't take a fly like we bite into an apple. Instead, they suck it up by expelling water through their gills. They can ingest and spit out a fly faster than you can say fish on. Such as, one should set the hook instantaneously and firmly, but not so hard as to break the fine tippet. The set should be into the fish, generally downstream. When completing your drift, do not immediately pick up if there is additional fishable water downstream. Instead, feed line into your drift, thereby extending its length. When you're ready to recast, let your rig swing slowly back toward the surface. This mimics an emerging insect rising toward the surface and is known as the Leeson ring lift. If you see insects starting to hatch, try nymphing higher in the water column, as trout will certainly move up and take such vulnerable prey. If you repeatedly get no strikes on near-perfect drifts, try wiggling your rod tip or moving it up and down. This imparts a little life action into your flies. If consistently missing strikes, try shortening up the tippet between the split shot and the flies. As the hatch progresses, remove your flies and indicator and switch to a dry fly with a nymph on a dropper. The dry fly makes a good indicator and doubles the chance of hooking a fish due to working both the surface and the subsurface. With all the requirements of reading currents, lengthening and shortening leaders, adjusting weight, and repeated mending, there are ample opportunities for screwing up and having a fishless day. This can be frustrating, and Jason Randall says that you may question whether it's all worth it and if you should take up golf instead. Don't. I played golf for about 20 years and can attest that it is a much more difficult sport. On the other hand, there will be times when all this fiddling won't make any difference. The fish will strike with reckless abandon. I remember fishing a gravel bar in Alaska downstream from spawning sockeyes, where rainbows and dollies were gorging on the salmon eggs. My rig, consisting of an orange bead heavy split shot and with a yarn indicator, barely hit the water before fish struck, leaving me no time to mend. George, my guide, was helping another angler upstream, but he came back to check on me. He immediately castigated me for my ugly drifts. After telling him I caught 13 trout in that run, he just turned away and shook his head. It was better than parring every hole at Pebble Beach. Ron Bullock is a frequent contributor to Colorado Outdoors and is the author of the award-winning books Fly Fishing Colorado's Backcountry and The Fly Fishing Guide to 800 High Country Lakes in Colorado. Both are available through his website, ronbelak.com. This article is copyrighted by the author. Exploring angling in a wild place. Destination, Raw Wall Wilderness. Article by Janet George. Do you ever feel that you were born 150 years too late and missed out on the exploration age? Everything has become so known and familiar in your travels. There is comfort and efficiency with the familiar. But something deep in our nature wants to see what's over the next ridge, to walk new paths, to fish new waters. Can this urge to fish in new waters in the backcountry be termed exploration angling? Or does one have to travel to some faraway country, into remote jungles or trailless watersheds? According to Merriam-Webster, the definition of exploration is, quote, the action of traveling in or through an unfamiliar area in order to learn about it, end quote. I like this inclusive definition. It means all of us can be, quote-unquote, explorers on our own terms. For the past 2 summers, the Raw Wall Wilderness area in northern Colorado has been my exploration angling destination. Raw Wall is a Native American word meaning wild place. Located on the southern end of the Medicine Bow Mountain Range, about 40 miles west of Fort Collins, the Raw Wall Wilderness area was designated by the Wilderness Act of 1964 and later expanded in the Colorado National Forest Wilderness Act of 1980. Today, the Raw Wall Wilderness area contains 73,866 acres of forest, peaks, and alpine tundra within the Arapahoe-Roosevelt National Forest. Elevations range from 8,400 to almost 13,000 feet, and there are 85 miles of trails. Glaciers in the past epochs carved spectacular cirqued lakes into the high peaks. There are 25 named lakes ranging from size to 3 to 39 acres, and 3 more unnamed blue spots. Fortunately for the exploration angler, all 28 lakes hold trout. Raw Wall Wilderness lakes contain cutthroat, brook, and lake trout. Cutthroat trout are stocked by Colorado Parks and Wildlife airplanes as fingerlings in 15 lakes every other year. Brook trout were stocked long ago, likely with milk cans carried by horses, and are now self-sustaining in 15 lakes. Likewise, historic stockings of lake trout resulted in self-sustaining populations in 3 lakes. At least 6 of the Raw Wall lakes contain more than one trout species. In Raw Wall Wilderness area streams, brook trout dominate, but cutthroat swim in the higher reaches, and you might find a brown trout in lower reaches. Day and overnight trekking. Backpacking or using pack stock, like llamas, is the best way to visit the Raw Wall Wilderness area lakes since most are more than 5 miles from trailheads. However, stream fishing can be found on day hikes within 1 mile of parking lots. A single night backpack trip will suffice to take a lake or 2, but if you have the time for a multi-day trip, several lakes and streams can be explored in one outing. Rather than out-and-back trails typical of other Colorado wilderness areas, the Raw Wall's connected trail system allows for loops and through hikes from one trailhead to another. Trails going to lakes start primarily from the Blue Lake, West Branch, and Raw Way trailheads. One popular multi-day backpack loop begins at the West Branch trailhead, traveling up the West Branch Trail to the Raw Wall Trail. The Raw Wall Trail goes up and over Grassy Pass at over 11,000 feet in elevation, and then down to Camp Lake Trail, which leads back to the West Branch Trail and return to the West Branch Trailhead. This route allows the potential to fish a dozen lakes and 2 major streams, depending on the time you can commit. The loop is approximately 18 miles, but several miles can be added with side trips to Twin Crater Lakes or Upper Camp Lake. The Raw Walls Trail Array also allows those who have an extra shuttle vehicle to through hike between two of the three trailheads. For example, a shuttle vehicle can be left at the West Branch Trailhead for a backpack trip beginning at Raw Wall Trailhead. This trip would go up Raw Wall Trail over Grassy Pass to the West Branch Trail and down to the shuttle vehicle. This route allows two major streams and passes within a mile of 8 fishable lakes. That's a 16-mile through hike, with the option to add more mileage with a visit to Twin Crater Lakes or both Big and Little Rainbow Lakes. For those who want to be free from carrying all their gear, rental llamas are becoming more popular in the Raw Wall Wilderness area for overnight trips. Fishing. Fishing pressure is low at most lakes and streams throughout the Raw Wall Wilderness, although I have shared Blue, Twin Crater, Bench, and Little Rainbow lakes with other anglers. Trout in most lakes and streams, most of the time, are not difficult to catch on dry flies, nymphs, or buggers, given that they have only 3 or 4 months of ice-free feeding time and they don't see many artificial flies or lures. My 10 favorite Raw Wall Wilderness area flies include black and brown conehead buggers, beadhead woolly worms, Amy's ants, elk hair caddis, parachute madam X's, Adams, parachute Adams, chubby Chernobyls, hare's ear, and pheasant tails. I mostly fly fish, but anglers with spinning gear can fish the same flies using a bubble end and, of course, try their favorite spinner or spoon. Rods should be lightweight and break down into 2 to 4 pieces for packing ease. I prefer a 9-foot, 5-weight fly rod because I can buck afternoon wind and cast a moderately sized streamer. My friend carries a 7-foot telescoping Tenkara rod to fish small streams in addition to her 5-weight. We both prefer weight-forward floating flies on these trips, but also carry a 12-foot sinker leader in case trout are deeper. Know before you go. Wilderness regulations for the Raw Wall prohibits campfires above 10,800 feet and camping within 200 feet of trails, creeks, or lakes. Pets must be on a leash. Group size is limited to 12 people and/or livestock combined. Of course, no motorized equipment or mechanized travel is allowed, including drones, bikes, or carts. Unlike Rocky Mountain National Park to the south, timed entry or other access permits are not needed. Check the Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest website for updates each year before you visit. For fishing, a Colorado fishing license is required, and statewide trout fishing regulations apply to lakes and streams within the Raw Wall Wilderness area. Check Colorado Parks and Wildlife's fishing regulations each year to stay current. Regulation brochures are available at businesses that sell fishing licenses and at Colorado Parks and Wildlife offices and online. To ensure protection of the land, water, and wildlife for future visits, follow Leave No Trace principles. Blue Lake Trailhead. From the Blue Lake Trailhead, located on Colorado Highway 14 about 55 miles west of Fort Collins, is a 5-mile hike gaining 1,500 feet of elevation to Blue Lake perched just below timberline. 16-acre Blue Lake is regularly stocked with cutthroat trout. I've done well fishing dry flies and hopper imitations for trout up to 14 inches. If you see small fish schooling near the outlet, they are long-nosed suckers of unknown origin. Smaller 3-acre Hang Lake is about a quarter mile and a 400-foot elevation gain west of Blue Lake. Hang Lake is also stocked with cutthroats that are just as eager to take dry flies, but smaller than Blue Lake. Be advised, much of the Blue Lake Trail is within the 2020 Cameron Peak wildfire footprint, so watch for hazards like falling trees and rock slide potential. Stock are prohibited on the trail from May 15th through September 15th. Camping is prohibited within a quarter mile of Blue and Hanging Lakes. West Branch Trailhead. The West Branch Trailhead, located on the Laramie River Road, Laramie County Road 103, 7 miles north of Colorado Highway 14, offers access to the headwaters of the West Branch of the Laramie River and 5 named lakes, plus a couple of unnamed blue spots on the map. It's a 7-mile hike up the West Branch Trail, gaining 2,740 feet in elevation to Island and Carey Lakes. There are campsites at the junction of the West Branch and Blue Lake trails and about 1 mile below Island Lake. Both lakes are stocked with cutthroat trout, and Carey Lake has brook trout. Island Lake's cutthroats are temperamental, but Carey's brookies consistently gobble dry flies and woolly buggers. Timber Lake, about 3/4 of a mile south of Island Lake, is off-trail and requires bushwhacking with GPS, map, and compass, but it does contain cutthroat trout up to 14 inches. Twin Crater Lakes are best accessed from the West Branch Trailhead via the West Branch, Raw, and Twin Crater Lakes trails. Total trail distance from the West Branch Trailhead to the Upper Twin Crater Lake is 6.5 miles one way, gaining 2,686 feet in elevation. There are campsites along the trail below Twin Crater Lakes, and the area is popular with backpackers. Both lakes are stocked with cutthroat that grow to 15+ inches, and the area is beyond scenic. Rockhole and Bench Lakes are both north of Twin Crater Lakes, but require off-trail bushwhacking with map and GPS device to find. Bench Lake has brook trout to 10 inches in length, while Rockhole is lightly stocked with cutthroats. The West Bank Trailhead offers my preferred route to the two Camp Lakes brook and lake trout angling. It's 7.3 miles while gaining 2,300 feet in elevation from the trailhead to Camp Lake via the West Branch and Camp Lake trails. Upper Camp Lake is another 1 mile above Camp Lake via the Upper Camp Lake Trail. There are campsites at both lakes, but the best fishing is at Upper Camp Lake. Upper Camp Lake has a shallow shelf, making it tough to reach deeper water, except in the northeast corner. My friend and I caught lake trout on dry flies, terrestrials, and buggers, but brook trout up to 12 inches long were pickier, taking only a few dry flies. Brookies came easy to a dry fly in the creek between the lakes. Raw Trailhead. The Raw Trailhead, located on the Laramie River Road, Laramie County Road 103, 12 miles north of Colorado Highway 14, provides the most direct approach to the Raw's northern lakes. Hiking about 7.5 miles while gaining 2,600 feet in elevation on the Raw Trail brings the hiking angler to a group of 5 lakes connected with a network of short spur trails. Raw Lake number 1 and number 2 and Upper and Lower Sandbar Lakes are shallow and contain small brook trout. Big Rainbow Lake is stocked with cutthroat trout. Traveling north on McIntyre Lake Trail, about 3/4 of a mile, brings you to the deeper McIntyre Lake, which also holds larger brook trout. Sugar Bowl Lake, with its self-sustaining population of brook and lake trout, is a 1/4 mile west and upstream of McIntyre Lake. Raw Creek and the Raw Trail is full of hungry brookies. Raw Lakes number 3 and number 4 are 1/2 and 1.3 miles respectively, upstream of Raw Lake number 2. Both are deeper lakes and stocked with cutthroats. Raw Lake number 4 requires off-trail travel above timberline. Raw Lake number 4 requires off-trail travel above timberline with exposure to summer thunderstorms. Final words. If you're looking for an exploration angling destination that requires boots and backpack rather than an airline travel, take a look at Colorado's Raw Wilderness area. In a long weekend, you can learn about fish in a truly wild place. Additional resources to plan your trip. Visit the Raw Wilderness website found at fs.usda.gov. Colorado Parks and Wildlife fishing brochures found at cpw.info/fishing-brochure. Leave No Trace Principles, int.org/y/7-principles. Poudre Wilderness Volunteers trail summaries and maps at pwv.org/trails. Colorado Trail Explorer, Coretrex, a free mobile app for hiking, mountain biking, horseback riding, and motorized recreation from Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Visit trails.colorado.gov. National Geographic Trails Illustrated Topo Map, number 112, Poudre River, Cameron Pass, found at natgeomaps.com. And finally, Colorado Wilderness Topographical Hiking Map, Raw Wall Wilderness, found at outdoortrailmaps.com. Janet George is the senior wildlife biologist for Colorado Parks and Wildlife's Northeast region. She retired in 2019. This article is copyrighted by the author. The Secret Lives of Smallmouth Bass by Jack Ballard. Feeling the telltale pressure on the end of my line, I lifted the rod to set the hook. In those first few seconds, when an angler assesses whether it's the real thing versus an errant snagged chunk of underwater vegetation, and how a large fish might be secured on the hook, I ascertained two things. This was indeed a fish, and it was also very large and strong. With a powerful run upstream, it confirmed my conclusions. Yards into the surge, it erupted from the surface, its dark black shining in the morning sun, its tail slapping wildly as it cleared the water. On a second leap, it twisted sideways, its pale underbelly arcing upward, then following its bony lower jaw back to the river like a high jumper bending to clear the bar in a track meet. Some minutes later, I finally brought the still struggling specimen to net, my own pulse racing with the exhilaration of the uncertain tussle. I removed the hook, then allowed the fish to recover its own breathing underwater in the net before releasing 4 pounds of flesh and power into the current. Although most Western anglers would assume my adversary was one of the several species of trout, most likely a rainbow given its above-water antics, it was a fish of a different color, even though the river was within eyeshot of the rugged Rocky Mountains. A smallmouth bass yielded this memorable experience, a species widely revered east of the Mississippi, much lesser known to anglers in Colorado and elsewhere in the mountain states. Smallmouth bass are also known by a variety of nicknames: smallies, bronzebacks, brownies, or simply smallmouths. Their shape lands somewhere between the trout and the bluegill, slenderer than the sunfish, but less streamlined than the salmonid. Grab a football on either end and stretch it by around 30%, if you're the Hulk, and you'd be looking at the approximate shape of the smallmouth. Their coloration is greenish overall with dark blotches or regular vertical stripes on the body. Most also display a few horizontal bars along the head, which is visually dominated by a glaring red eye. The bass's appearance, however, varies widely in relation to habitat. Smallmouth bass living in rivers with murkier water often develop very dark coloration, dark brownish olive along the back and head that appears nearly black in low light, with less notable splotching on dusky bronze emerald sides, lightening only to whitish hues on the belly. Bass found in lakes with clear water and pale sandy bottoms are typically much lighter in hue, sometimes appearing light green overall, with virtually no stripes or spots on the body. Largemouth bass are the bronzeback's nearest relative in Colorado in terms of behavior and appearance. Distinguishing between the two is important where both are present. Regulations in legal size and numbers in the limit may be different for the two species. Largemouth bass are identified by distinct horizontal stripe on their sides and tend to have a more overall greenish appearance, versus the greenish bronze of the smallmouth. However, the coloration of the largemouth bass can vary markedly due to the variations in strain and habitat. Additionally, the jaws of the largemouth extend just beyond their eyes when their mouths are shut, while the jaws of the smallmouth bass may reach to their eyes but not beyond. The dorsal fins on the back of smallmouth bass are connected. Those of largemouth bass have a slight break between the forward and rear fins. Smallmouth bass were introduced to Colorado in 1951. Currently, they inhabit numerous lakes and ponds across the state, along with some stream systems. Although the nickname smallie doesn't conjure up an image of a powerful being, smallmouth bass are widely considered perhaps the most fighting of any freshwater fish in North America. On a middleweight fly or spinning rod, even a foot-long smallmouth can surprise the angler with its acrobatics and tenacity. Fishing for smallmouth bass requires some adjustment in tackle and techniques for the average trout hunter. Bronzebacks can be caught on standard trout tackle, but committed bass anglers generally opt for something with a little more heft. On the fly side, 5 and 6 weight rods are preferred by most Rocky Mountain trout chasers, but confirmed bass addicts often opt for the extra heavy heft of a 7 or 8 weight rod. When it comes to spinning tackle, rods around 7 feet long in the medium power range and fast action are considered ideal. It's not that the bass themselves are impossible to handle on lighter tackle. I've landed several hefty smallmouths in the 4 to 5 pound range with a 5 weight fly rod. But each time the fish was hooked in water on rivers and lakes devoid of heavy vegetation. Bass are usually caught in the vicinity of cover, such as weed beds, lily pads, and submerged rocks or logs. When hooked, they often make a headlong rush toward cover. A stiffer, heavier rod helps the angler turn the fish before it can dive into a line-tangling snarl of aquatic vegetation. Line characteristics are similarly dictated by bass habitat. In open water with minimal vegetation, smallmouths can be capably brought to net with 3x to 4x tippet on fly rods, 6-pound or 8-pound line on spinning tackles. In weedy locations or sections of the lake overgrown with lily pads, step up to a 2x to 0x tippet for fly fishing, 10-pound to 14-pound line on spinning gear. One of the most frustrating aspects of smallmouth fishing is breaking off a big fish that runs into cover. Then it gets wrapped in vegetation. Do yourself a favor and make sure you have enough power in the rod and strength in the line to winch a big bass from cover. With their intensely predatory instincts, bass are notorious for their ability to consume sizable prey. On numerous occasions, I've seen smallmouth bass, smaller than the span of my thumb and index finger, engulf flies and lures nearly half as long as their bodies. Such behavior is built right into the biology of bass. Research in a variety of environments has found that baby smallmouths consume aquatic insects and tiny crustaceans. By the time they reach a mere 3 inches in length, their diet normally switches to crayfish and minnows. Although there are some exceptions to this general rule, choosing a lure for bass is similar to making a selection when fishing for big brown trout, another species that preys heavily upon other fish. A fly or lure that mimics a minnow is always a safe bet for smallmouths. Since they also happily prey upon leeches and crayfish, imitations of those creatures can equally be effective, where they are present in bass haunts. And don't forget those options that really don't represent any aquatic organism at all. Last summer, my son and I fished for smallmouths on either end of a 17-foot canoe. He cast a spinning rod with a jig whose skirt consisted of nothing but olive-colored fibers like those of a rubber band. I looped a similarly hued conehead woolly bugger from my fly rod, also adorned with rubber legs. Both proved to be the best lures of the day in relation to their respective tackle. For the record, if I had to choose one color for smallmouth fishing, it would be olive. Ideally, I like two-tone flies and lures, particularly olive white, followed by brown orange and yellow white. In murky water, black baits are often the best. Having a suitable fly or lure is key to catching bass, but knowing where to fish is more important. If they're in the biting mood, bronzeback will attack most perceived meals that pass within ambush distance of a hungry mouth. Casting your wares parallel to the edges of and above underwater weed beds puts your bait in feeding range of bass haunts. On slow days, utilizing a fly or lure with a weed guard and working it right through sparse to moderately dense vegetation is another good bet. Also, fish against flotillas of lily pads or retrieve lures and flies around underwater structure such as boulders, sunken logs, or dips and rises in the lake bed. On rivers, smallmouths congregate in the areas where the current is subdued by the bank or structure. They're also fond of warmer backwaters when the water temperatures are cooler, and frequently hang out in the streams between slack areas and current. In fact, water temperature is a highly important aspect of smallmouth behavior and angling success. When water temperatures drop below 60 degrees in the fall, bronzebacks frequently migrate to deep pools where they become lethargic and enter a somewhat hibernated state. In rivers, researchers have recorded them moving some more than 60 miles on migration, sometimes traveling over 12 miles per day. In the spring, spawning commences when the water temperature reaches 61 to 65 degrees. the fish become quite aggressive just prior to spawning, a window of angling opportunity that usually occurs in Colorado from mid-April to mid-May, depending on the location. Otherwise, observational studies indicate smallmouths are most active in water temperatures from 68 to 82 degrees, above which they retreat to deeper, cooler water or become sluggish. Along with their reputation as challenging game fish, bronzebacks are equally appealing on the dinner plate. Their flesh is white, firm, and mild. Smallmouths are quite easy to fillet, my favorite way of preparing them for the pan. Although transplants to the state, anglers familiar with the species regard them as highly as other non-native, though naturalized species like rainbow trout. For this fisherman, they're an exceptionally tasty slice of the big, piscivorous pie served to Colorado anglers. Jack Ballard has written hundreds of articles on both spin and fly fishing. See more of his work at jackballard.com. Down the tubes for trout. When fishing Colorado's lakes, reservoirs, and still waters where trout reside, many anglers have found that float tubes and pontoons are affordable, highly portable, and perfect for backcountry trips. Article by Mike Natkowski. I doubt there's a place where float tubes and pontoons are more popular than Colorado. Coloradans are trout crazy for good reason. The state has an abundance of quality trout waters, and some would argue they are the best in the country. Many are famous streams and rivers that draw an inordinate amount of attention. But there are even more lakes, reservoirs, and still waters where trout reside. Many have limited access, so a tube or tune is ideal for exploring and sampling their bounty. Many of us started with a relatively primitive float tube that was nothing more than an inner tube with a seat. It served the purpose of getting us away from the shore, helping us cover water, and ultimately catch more fish. The next logical upgrade is a U-shaped float tube. A U-shaped tube gets anglers slightly higher out of the water, is more comfortable, and is much easier to get in and out of. These tubes are portable and lightweight, making them perfect for backcountry trips. Anglers who start their journey with a float tube quickly learn there's something bigger and better out there and naturally gravitate to a pontoon. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. In recent years, both float tubes and pontoons have been redesigned and improved upon to give anglers more options than ever. Even though a pontoon would seem to be a huge improvement over a float tube, a tube still has several advantages. One advantage is the cost. You can find several serviceable float tubes for $129. Experts recommend dropping at least $200 to $300 if you want a decent quality tube. The cheapest pontoon you'll find will cost 2 to 3 times what you can expect to spend on a float tube, and you can spend as much as $2,000 or more getting a pontoon just the way you like it, complete with the trolling motor. Many anglers find that neither a float tube nor a pontoon can do everything they want, so they purchase both. The advantages of float tubes are cost, portability, and space. The minimal investment you need to get a float tube is a big attraction. You get a tube, and at the very least, you can go fishing. Getting away from shore, even a short distance, is a huge advantage. Being able to stuff and deflate the tube in the back of your vehicle makes sense when space is limited. Then, you'll still have room for your tent, sleeping bag, and tackle. Once you reach your destination, whether it's a reservoir on the Front Range or a mountain lake, you need to reinflate the tube. Doing so is easy using a pump plugged into your vehicle's cigarette lighter or with a simple hand pump. Both methods go quickly. Then, it's a simple matter of getting to the water. Carrying a float tube on your back is doable if you can't drive up to the water. Float tubes utilize fins for propulsion and to hold one's position. This leaves your hands free for casting. Getting into the water with fins on can be awkward. In most cases, it's best done backwards. Don't be ashamed if you look like a fish out of water, and almost everyone who owns a float tube will take a tumble or two. Fins may be slightly lacking if you have to buck a strong wind, but for the most part they are totally adequate, and a slow, steady kick will get you to shore. Float tubes are less affected by wind because of their lower profile. That alone is a big plus in windy Colorado. But the fact that a float tube sits low in the water can also be a liability. This lower vantage points prohibits seeing into the water. Casting efficiency is reduced, and you'll get your elbows wet on occasion. Float tubes are very responsive. With the kick of a fin, you can spin on a dime and maneuver into tight spaces that others may not be able to reach. Being able to access brushy shorelines or rocky cliff faces that aren't accessible from the shore is a huge advantage. Float tubes also allow you to fish parallel to the shoreline to maximize your presentation, or fish from deep water to shallow and vice versa. The fact that float tubes are highly portable is a godsend for those who like to fish in the backcountry. Float tubes are ideal for carrying, packing, and deploying in remote destinations. There are no frills models complete with shoulder straps designed for backpacking. They're lightweight and easy to carry. Range and speed are limited in a float tube. Normally, you don't want to stray too far from the launch site and have a long kick back to the vehicle with daylight and leg strength fading. Unexpected wind and wave action could make the task even more arduous. In some ways, float tubes limit the way you can fish. With only leg power, you can't maintain enough speed to troll. You can use the wind and flippers to drift, but don't forget you need to get back. If you're considering using a float tube in moving water, remember they're not as safe as a pontoon for that application. One advantage of a pontoon versus a float tube is you have all the additional space, pockets, and carrying capacity. Sometimes less is good. With less storage, you're forced to bring only the essential gear and tackle when fishing from a float tube. Pontoons are generally more comfortable than the float tube because they sit higher in the water, but their higher profile also makes them more susceptible to the wind. Sitting higher means you have greater visibility and improved casting form, line control, fighting fish abilities, and comfort. But all of that comes at a cost. Pontoons are heavier, larger, and more challenging to transport and store than float tubes. Pontoons are more complicated to break down and reassemble than a tube. An alternative to breaking down a pontoon after every trip is a roof rack, pickup bed, or even a trailer so you can haul them assembled. It's good advice not to purchase a pontoon you can't load alone. Pontoons are the best choice for backpacking into remote destinations, only if you can easily get them there. Pontoons need oars and frames. Optional lean bars and standing platforms increase fishing flexibility and visibility, but add weight. New wave pontoons come with oar locks and trolling motor mounts to facilitate the use of oars and trolling motors for propulsion. These options increase the range and speed of the pontoons. Oars are typically used for getting from point A to point B, especially if you don't have a trolling motor. Trolling motors are a godsend when it comes time to head home or to shore, especially when you have a blustery wind to buck. It also keeps your hands free for fishing. Pontoons are difficult to propel with fins alone. Fins are handy for making short moves when sneaking into casting range of rising trout. Pontoons only require a few inches of water to launch, which makes getting in the craft easier. Multiple air chambers make pontoons safer overall than float tubes with single air chambers. Most high-quality float tubes, though, feature air chambers for the back and armrests, providing an additional level of safety. Carrying capacity is a consideration before buying either a tube or a pontoon. In either case, it's better to have too much than not enough. Match the craft to your body weight and consider the added weight of a trolling motor, battery, and tackle. It's better to err on the side of excess. One of the simplest yet most important components to either a float tube or a pontoon is the seat. You're going to be spending countless hours perched in the seat, so make sure it's as comfortable and conforming as possible. An adjustable, padded backrest will pay for itself many times over. To further complicate things, anglers now have the option of a pontube. A pontube is a cross between a float tube and a pontoon. The pond tube size and shape are a hybrid between a pontoon and a float tube and incorporate the best features of both. Pond tubes offer more flotation than float tubes and less wind resistance than a pontoon. The added flotation makes pond tubes a better choice than a float tube for larger anglers. Most pond tubes offer oars for propulsion and will accommodate a trolling motor. Pond tubes have more space for tackle storage than tubes. The portability and cost of pond tubes lies somewhere between the float tube and a pontoon. Regardless of the watercraft you choose, safety is always a consideration. It's especially important when fishing from a tube or tune. Check the weathercast before and while you're fishing. Modern weather apps make it easier than ever to keep tabs on the weather. Storms in the west can come up in a hurry, and the last place you want to be when a storm hits is on the water wielding a 9-foot lightning rod. Wind is a constant nemesis in the west. Mornings are generally calmer, so take advantage of the morning bite. Safety begins before you even get on the water. Store a float tube or pontoon out of direct sunlight and never store them fully inflated, especially in a vehicle. Sunlight can cause the shell of a tube or a pontoon to deteriorate more quickly and cause threads to rot, seams to split, and valves to leak. Give your craft a thorough safety check before you hit the water, especially if you haven't used it in a while. I was fishing Harvey Gap Reservoir a few years ago for my float tube, having a ball, catching monster bluegills and spunky pike, when I felt myself sinking lower in the water and my elbows were getting wet. I turned and kicked as hard as my fins would take me for the shoreline. I made it before my tube deflated completely. Once safely on shore, I looked for obvious holes, and I gave the air valve a good twist, and it came out in my hand. It's always a good idea to have a repair kit along. I dried everything off and used a super adhesive to secure the valve. Having a cell phone in a waterproof container and a whistle is good insurance too. Although you're sitting in a huge flotation device when in either a pontoon or a float tube, it's still vital to wear a life jacket. Inflatable life jackets are so thin and comfortable that you'll hardly notice you even have them on, and there's no reason not to wear them. Whether a float tube or a pontoon is a watercraft varies from state to state, so check regulations. Rules apply regarding aquatic invasive species and may require that your pontoon or float tube be inspected each time before you launch and receive certification. One of the biggest potential hazards for float tubes and pontoons is punctures. Sharp sticks and sharp hooks are potential puncture hazards that anglers need to avoid. Pay particular attention when fighting fish near your craft, especially when using lures with multiple hooks. Float fishing is less strenuous than running a marathon, but it helps if you're reasonably fit. Don't assume you're all set because you have a trolling motor. Trolling motors can fail, batteries die, and you may need to return to shore the old-fashioned way. Running or leg work exercises can ensure that you meet the challenge if you must employ a little fin power. With float tubes and pontoons, you can drift, cast, troll, vertical jig, or anything in between. Tubes and tunes are especially popular for fly fishing. You can cover more water without making repetitive casts. Float tubes and pontoons allow you to position so you can cast parallel to weed lines and drop-offs and keep you offering in the strike zone for the maximum amount of time. You can also cast to the shallows and slowly retrieve your lure down a sloping bank to deeper water. Other times, when a hatch is taking place, you can quietly hover and position near rising trout. During periods of inactivity, you can drift and drag imitations slowly along without much effort and cover lots of water. For pontoons equipped with trolling motors, you can even troll deep diving crankbaits and target the depths. For pontoons equipped with rod holders, you can use multiple lines and maximize your chances. A regular contributor to Colorado Outdoors, Mike Natkowski is a professional freelance writer and photographer. Find out more at natgnoutdoors.wordpress.com. Finding Joy by Dan England. Denise Joy will see a young fish swimming through an alpine lake she's hiked for hours to reach and feels proud of it. "You made it," she will think and smile to herself. "Good job." It's not a parent's pride she feels. That's for the workers at the Colorado Parks and Wildlife fish hatcheries. Nonetheless, she's had a brief but important role in the little one's life. She's likely the one who got it there. Joy flies for CPW as one of the organization's full-time pilots. She helps give biologists a bird's-eye view of their research, such as tracking and surveying big game herds, but she spends a good bit of time in the air stalking alpine mountain lakes. This is not a job for everyone. It's not even a job for most pilots. Many of the lakes are tucked into mountain cirques, leaving Joy little room for error. Even when working as a pilot already doesn't have much tolerance for mistakes. She has to fly into a small area, guarded by the peaks, maneuver just above the lake, drop the fish, and quickly climb out of the high alpine cirque, all while keenly monitoring the winds those giants inspire. If that sounds stressful, well, you're right. One pilot died in a downdraft 15 years ago. Denise had to fly 2 years dropping fish with fellow CPW pilots before flying them solo. This is the training for every newly hired pilot. But she wanted to learn more on her own, too. So, besides studying the maps, she hiked to the lakes. Quote, "There were a few really challenging lakes in the San Juans and Holy Cross, so I hiked them to get a better visual for it," Joy said. "You can see how the winds are working, what they're actually doing in this cirque versus the other, how each area has its own microclimates," end quote. That led to a talk with Larry Gepfert, a longtime pilot for CPW, about how much fun it would be to fish all the lakes they've stocked. Yes, Gepfert told her, you should do that. The unofficial bet was sealed that day. Joy sometimes wishes she'd looked at how many lakes the CPW stocks before she made it. CPW stocked 245 in 2021 and more than 300 in 2022. CPW stocks a lake every other year by regions, divided by north and south. Joy has probably stocked more than 300 herself. So for now, that's her goal, to hike and to fish every lake she brings to life. She's closer than you may think. Joy is the first female pilot CPW ever hired. She started her career in Alaska, and she was proud to be a pilot because of what she endured to get there. A long, arduous path from her first flight at the age of 18. She didn't have the same resources as others, including financial stability from home, or aviators in the family to help mentor her. Quick internet searches for scholarships and finding new communities were not options yet. She had numerous jobs, including restaurants, scraping enough money together for flight school, and then something would happen. One time, the owner of a school had an accident with his aircraft and flew into a building. The school closed. She'd hoped to be treated like an equal, but things were a bit different 20 years ago. For all the folks that helped her on her path, there were many who challenged her abilities. She faced and triumphed over many unfair biases and rude comments to realize her dream. She stayed with it because even at 8, she had a burning desire to fly. Anyone with a stressful job, or most jobs really, need to find ways to decompress at the end of the day. Quote, "Flying can be especially hard on the nervous system," end quote, says Joy. Pilots train themselves for smooth reactions and to think clearly and calmly in challenging situations. Look at the way Sully Sullenberg landed his plane on the Hudson River when he lost both engines, saving the lives of 155. One of the reasons she loves her job is not only the beautiful areas it takes her to. Not many others got to see the mountain cirques where she dumped the fish, but just a handful of others got the perspective she did from the front seat of a plane. When Joy moved from place to place with her mother and brothers, the outdoors were always there. Quote, "Nature was my playground. It was my solace," end quote, she said. She talks about that journey in a short documentary, Fight or Flight, that made the rounds of the outdoor film festivals and was publicly released this year. She has since learned to respect nature and that certain parts of it aren't always there for you. When hiking, and especially when flying above the tree line, it can be a blustery place where a fast storm can strike you down. Quote, "The mountains have their own spirit," she said. "Sometimes they want you to come visit, and sometimes they don't." End quote. The trips to the lakes vary from 4-mile treks to 17-mile journeys. A few are ensconced in the Needle Mountains, and it took her 42 miles of backpacking to reach them. Some require scrambling, but not many, and some aren't mapped. More than a few don't have a guidebook leading her to them. She'd probably use a map and compass anyway. She doesn't keep a list. "I should," she said, but she knows what she's done, and it's more than 100. Yes, 100, since she began 5 years ago. She generally goes in the summer, like most alpine hikers, because the snow melts, clearing the trails. In 2022, she did 18. She did 20 in 2023. Quote, "I keep getting more and more serious about it," end quote, she said. She picks the lakes she goes to at random, though it's not like it's a dartboard. Quote, "I have a list of lakes that I want to do that year, but then I'll fly over and change my mind on the list," Joy said. "Sometimes lakes get priority because it's just so beautiful, and I just have to go," end quote. Fishing is much more intentional for her. She didn't like fishing when she first tried it, but she learned to use fishing, as much as hiking, to heal herself. Quote, "You have to be still, and stillness is hard," she said, "but it's taught me so much, to be in the moment. It's also such a cool thing. How many people can say they stock the fish and also fish them?" End quote. It's been harder for her, she admits, as the Front Range continues to widen and draw even more people to it. She used to see maybe 1 or 2 fishing with her. They're not 14ers after all, or famous hikes, or easy to reach, but she's seeing more and more people who don't respect the land as much, leaving trash and waste. The wilderness, even her backyard, was a wide open private space for her. She can't help but feel a little protective of it. Quote, "There's magic in that space and that alpine," end quote, she said. Dan England is a freelance author and editor and a frequent contributor to Colorado Outdoors. This article is copyrighted by the author. Thank you for joining us for this special edition of Colorado Outdoors, the 2024 Fishing Guide, read by John Arnold.